Hello. Hi there. My name is Oliver Brewer-Lennon, and I'm very, very glad to have you here for an illustrated talk by Canon Ian Gomersall entitled Anglican Missals and Their Canons. This talk is part of Adorate, which is a week-long initiative from the Society of Catholic Priests held during the octave of Corpus Christi. It's intended to make space for prayer, reflection, and renewed attention to the mystery of the Eucharist, not only in personal devotion, but in the shared life of the Church. Tonight, we turn to some of the texts that have shaped the way Anglicans have prayed the Eucharist over time. Father Ian, who serves as the European Provincial Rector of SCP, will guide us through a number of Anglican Missals, drawing out what they reveal about theological emphases, views on authority, and the shape of Catholic belief within Anglicanism. The talk will also look to the present, asking how those perspectives might still inform the Catholic movement today. We have had a strong response to this session, which is so encouraging, and it means we'll need, though, to keep things slightly structured. Just a couple of practical notes, if I may. Can I ask that everyone remain muted during the presentation? So if you could just take a moment now to make sure that you are muted, that will be helpful. There'll be time for Q&A at the end. Can I ask, though, that you please hold your questions and comments until that time? If you need to communicate with me during the presentation, then you might want to use Zoom's chat function. And finally, if you're on a computer and not a mobile device, you may want to go full screen with your Zoom application so that you can clearly see the illustrations that Ian will be sharing in his presentation. But for now, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, Father Ian.
Thank you very much, Father Oliver, and I'm delighted to give this talk. And it will really be an illustrated talk. I've got a good number of slides which I'll speak to, and I'll explain why it's illustrated in this way in a moment. Unfortunately, there's been a slight hiccup from my PC to Zoom, so I'm going to have to ask Oliver to change each slide as they come. And I hope you'll bear with me with that. So, Oliver, if we begin the presentation, please. Thank you. Anglican Missals and Their Canons, an illustrated introduction. And I'm dedicating this presentation to a dear friend of mine, Father Mark Dolby, who died in 2013. And some of you may know that he, in fact, wrote a booklet with this very title, Anglican Missals and Their Canons. I'm actually Mark's executor, and so the literary rights, as it were, passed to me. And when I discussed this, when Mark was alive, I pointed out that one of the disadvantages of his booklet was the lack of illustrations, which he accepted. It was to do with the type of publication. So I thought, as a balance to that, and in his memory, I would give an illustrated introduction using much of his thought in this talk, but adding images and my own thoughts, adding images from my own collection of missals and from missals that I've looked at, particularly in Pusey House Library and more particularly in the British Library in London. We'll begin, first of all, Oliver, with the first slide. Now, I want to introduce the whole topic. We'll understand it better by looking at the earliest liturgies of the Church of England at the Reformation. Here we see a reproduction of the 1549 Book of Common Prayer. Actually, it's a reproduction of an original from 1549. You will see on the large sheet what's called the introductory dialogue to the prayer, "The Lord be with you and with thy spirit." It's not easy to read, I know, but I wanted this particular version. Then it goes into what we often call the preface. It is very meet, right, and our bounden duty. And then after the holy, 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 we find the 1549 rite goes straight into the prayer for the whole state of Christ's church, then the consecration prayer, and then the oblation. Don't worry if you can't read this, just listen to what I'm saying. But it was a long Eucharistic prayer, which in our next slide now, we will see was reduced very significantly 3 years later in the 1552 Book of Common Prayer, a more Protestant prayer book, we may say. There, after the Sanctus, the Holy, 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 the prayer "We do not presume" is said, and then a short prayer of consecration. Now, even from the 16th century, we find that many Anglican bishops certainly were not particularly happy with 1552. And so we find, for example, in our next slide, here we find the Scottish liturgy, which had an unfortunate effect on Scotland, but nevertheless reflects the views of Archbishop Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, who imposed the Scottish liturgy on the Scottish Church. There you see, "Therefore with angels, the holy, holy, holy." And what Laud has done is then goes straight into the prayer of consecration, as it's known in the 1662 prayer book, but adds after that, straight after that, what's called the prayer of oblation. And that was found to be more satisfactory, and in fact became the basis for the liturgy of the Episcopal Church of Scotland, with variations, which, as you may know, also transferred for various historical reasons into the American Episcopal Church. So some of the issues that I'm talking about are really quite focused on England, but they will have some also bearing on the liturgies of other parts of the Anglican communion as we go through, and as we begin to look at the rise of Anglo-Catholicism in the 19th century. But for now, on our next slide, we see a great bishop of the Church of England, Thomas Wilson. There he is in his splendid robes and wig, Bishop of Sodor and Man, a saintly bishop, who in the 1770s published, as you can see the version there, a short and plain instruction for the better understanding of the Lord's Supper, with the necessary preparation required for the benefit of young communicants, etc., etc. Interestingly, you see at the very bottom, published in English and in Manx. Manx for the use in his own diocese on the Isle of Man. I've included this because what is happening, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, is a growth in what we could call lay manuals, lay communicant manuals. These are books that were given to the laity to help them engage more with the Holy Communion, to understand what was going on. But what's also happening is that we find by the 19th century, as a commentator of the Society of the Blessed Sacrament says, it is a general habit now with many priests to carry to the altar a book of private devotions. So it's not only the laity who have these books of private devotions, but the priests, who were often using books like Wilson's, the lay version, were taking these books to the altar to supplement the prayers that they were using. At the same time, I'll come back to that point in a moment, but at the same time, as we see in our next slide, specific books for Holy Communion were being produced. This from 1844 by Pickering is in fact the reproduction of the altar book that Father McConaughey used at St. Albans, Holborn, and very finely printed with lovely lettering and illustrations around and so on. And we find such books being printed in the 19th century so that seen as worthy of being on the altar. And we find, for example, in our next slide, Mowbray's. The next slide, Oliver. Oh, it's here. Sorry, Mowbray's publishing. Here we see in 1869 what they are calling the Anglican Missal. Somebody among my audience may correct me here. I believe this is the first use of the term missal in an Anglican setting, 1869. It is, in fact, in Mowbray's case, the whole of the 1662 rite. There are no additions or interpolations, but it's very finely illustrated, as we see in the next slide. Here is the prayer of consecration with, previous to that, Oliver, if you could. Here's the prayer of consecration, part of it on the right-hand side, and you'll see the fine illustration there that the priest would be looking at as he was praying at the altar. This is very much a 19th century phenomenon, and a new phenomenon, but it's also, of course, due to the improvements in printing. Interestingly, you will see on the right-hand side, just to the left of this is my body, the priest elevating the chalice wearing a chasuble. That would be very uncommon at the time of the publication of this missal. Now, the first book, which we see in our next slide, the first book which was printed deliberately to supplement the Book of Common Prayer, was The Priest to the Altar. Now, it was deliberately designed as a supplement. The first edition was very large and privately printed in 1861. As I said at the beginning, I'm using some images from my own collection. I don't have a first edition, I only have the fifth edition. So this is a later edition. The first two editions were quite simple, but by the fifth edition, it's a significant enlargement. And here we see again the prayer of the Canon of the Eucharist. Now, At first, it was thought that H.P. Liddon was the author of this work, but in fact, later it became clear and was admitted, because earlier editions were anonymous, that it was Peter Goldsmith Maid, an Oxford scholar who had a high regard for the Book of Common Prayer and was anxious not to add to the text of the prayer book, but more to give in a book words that would help the priest to celebrate with devotion. So we've still got the text of the 1662 prayer book, but Med is using what is called Sarum use, that is Salisbury use before the Reformation, using texts from what I'll continue to call the Sarum Missal, Sarum use. He's using those to help the priest in their devotion. Thank you, Oliver. And at about the same time, another significant work is produced. Now, this is not a missal as such. This is more an aid, as it says, directions for the right celebration of the Holy Communion, produced by Father Purchas and later by, it's admitted that most of the work in later editions was by Father Lee of Lambeth, who was quite well known in Anglo-Catholic circles, certainly in the late 19th century, and was a curious character in many ways, but I'm not here to talk about curious characters, more about missals. So the Directorium Anglicanum was inspired again by Sarum, as it says, really. It talks about what was in use in the second year of King Edward VI, a key thing for such people. And it suggests, again, using the prayer of oblation that was separated in 1552, it suggests putting it in the 1549 position. I mentioned Father Lee of Lambeth, and in the next slide, we see the altar as suggested in the Directorium Anglicanum, and there you see on the altar a missal of note of a worthy book placed on the altar on the bookrest. This was a significant point in the creation of such missals and forms part, as it says there, of the altar vested. I mentioned Father Lee, and in our next slide, you'll see here he is on the left. In 1867, he produced missals which interpolated some of the Sarum rite and instructions for the celebrant. Now, Lee's altar service book, as he called it, was actually quite modest, and but it did include some additions. And being the vicar of Lambeth at the time, he boldly dedicated his volumes to Archbishop Longley, who we see on the right there, and duly presented him with copies. He walked along to Lambeth Palace, knocked on the door, as it were, and presented the Archbishop with the copies of his altar service book. Longley gratefully accepted them, but then a day or two later, Lee got a letter from Longley. Longley, some of you may know, was probably the most mild-mannered Archbishop of Canterbury in the 19th century. And there he is in that photograph. I must add as a footnote, a photograph taken by Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodson, Longley was the person that Lewis Carroll photographed the most. He had a hobby as a photographer, and the Dodgsons and Longleys were great friends. But anyway, Longley returned the book with these words: "Dear Mr. Lee, when you did me the favour of leaving at Lambeth Palace large paper copies of the Communion Service and of the Epistles and Gospels, I accepted them under the full impression that they were merely reprints of the Book of Common Prayer. Finding that this is not the case, and that you have taken liberties with the prayer book, of which I do not approve, I find myself compelled to decline the offer, and I will take an opportunity of sending them back to you as soon as possible." So there we are. And this was a feature of bishops in this period. They did not tolerate any additions to the Book of Common Prayer. Wilberforce in Oxford, for example, was asked if a priest could use a harvest thanksgiving collect in harvest festivals, and he said bishops didn't have the authority to add such prayers to the set worship of the Book of Common Prayer. It needed royal authority, he said. Well, nevertheless, in our next slide, we see that as early, we believe, as 1865, there were some clergy using pure form, the Missale Romanum, and certainly the Sisters of the Poor in Shoreditch and Edgware were having their masses always in Latin from the Roman Missal. Of course, that was very exceptional and unusual. Next slide, please. For the first time here in the ritual of the altar, by the interestingly named Orby Shipley, the author introduces into the actual liturgy the secret prayers and other rubrics to, as it were, make the prayer book liturgy higher in tradition. So we find communions, post-communions, and so on being added. And Orby Shipley also includes, as you can see on the right, very detailed instructions on how the Mass is to be celebrated. This was rather groundbreaking. It's the first instance of a published work interpolating into the Book of Common Prayer in this way. Lee had begun it, but his work was not broadly published. And then we move on in the next slide to, in 1894, we find another work appearing. What was happening is that there was a growing tension, and this will draw out as we go into the 20th century, a growing tension between priests who were looking back to Sarum, the Sarum Rite, pre-Reformation, as they thought it was from the Sarum Missal in England at the time of the first prayer book, and those who were looking to Rome as the most authoritative Catholic source for liturgy, and looked to Rome for their inspiration. And the two were not always on friendly terms on this matter. They could be disparaging of one another, as again we'll find out in a moment. Meanwhile, up in Scotland again, in our next slide, here is an altar service book produced by the prolific author Vernon Staley, Anglo-Catholic, who was the provost of Inverness Cathedral. Now, Staley really produced this for what we could call a prayer book party, but he has picked up very much the idea, as we can see here, of the illustrated missal. And the book is lavishly illustrated throughout. Very expensive copies were printed on vellum and less expensive on high quality paper. This was the first of the missals of the 20th century, and Staley was a convinced advocate of the English use and also produced the ceremonial of the English Church, partly as a compliment to this missal. And meanwhile, a great friend of some, but not of all Anglo-Catholics, in our next slide, we see a work that at the time was very popular, the English liturgy, produced, again, sorry, this is my edition from 1930. It was actually produced, first of all, in 1903 by Percy Dearmer. Author, of course, of the Parson's Handbook, he produced the English liturgy. Finally produced again the illustrations here by Lawrence Houseman, printer and designer, the brother of A.E. Houseman, the poet and a great suffragist, as in fact was Mrs. Dearmer. And here, the authors, which included the great Walter Frere of the Community of the Resurrection, enhanced the Book of Common Prayer. The book was appointed for singing, so the epistles and gospels could be sung easily, almost a singular feature of this missal. It's not found in other Anglican missals at all in the 20th century. And at the end, additional material from other sources. But here again, there was tension, because the Bishop of Rochester, who wrote the introduction, whilst saying what a fine book it was saying that the additional collects were not officially authorized, and he himself would not authorize some of them in his diocese. So there was an ambiguity about it all. But it was a very popular work, and we see in the next slide how it was. Here we see the music given, music printed, the fine illustrations of Houseman, black print, red rubrics, a quality work that remained in print remarkably, I think, until the 1960s, although very much fading away by then. Turning now, we're moving to another part of London in our next slide, and we are in Hoxton in 1906. The vicar's been there for about a year. There's a photograph of the interior of his church. It was the scene of some Kensingtonite riots about this time and later, as a ritualistic church. The vicar was Father Kenrick, a fascinating man in many ways, brought up an evangelical in India, converted to an extreme form of Anglo-Catholicism, and was a meticulous liturgist, and also a meticulous botanist. The Kenrick collection of botanical specimens is still in the Hull University Botanical Collection, where it's catalogued. and in his retirement, Father Kenrick continued his work with wildflowers. Rather reflective, perhaps of some Anglo-Catholic liturgists. I remember meeting the great Father Lamburn, who was an expert on the all systems timetable of the British Railways at the time, as well as being a meticulous liturgist. And perhaps the two go together. Some of you may know the story about the undergraduate who spoke to the rather crotchety Dean Ing, who was visiting King's College, Cambridge, and said, "Excuse me, Dean, are you interested in liturgy?" And the Dean replied, "No, I am not, and nor do I collect postage stamps." So that shows what he thought of it all. Meanwhile, in our next slide, this is why we're in Hoxton, because Father Kenrick in 1906 is writing in manuscript the English Missal. There's its binding on the left, there's its initial second leaf page actually on the right. Missale Anglicanum, the English Missal. And in our next slide, we see the remarkable quality of this manuscript copy. It really is extraordinary. But we also see what Father Kenrick was about, because he tells us. And what he's about is having for his altar a beautiful book in which he's also wonderful calligraphy. He's doing the calligraphy. A religious sister in the parish does the illustrations, and Mrs. Kenrick translates much of the Latin of the Roman Missal, where he's drawing on the Roman Missal, into English. Fortunately, she was a good translator of Latin, but we have to say the authority of the translation is only that of Mrs. Kenrick, not of any church authority. But we also see in the introduction there that Father Kenrick is putting before us, and we'll see this in a moment, putting before us, he's cut out and collected illustrations of art, religious art, and he pastes them into his manuscript missal. He stretches things a bit. The Latin parts are sanctioned in principle by the preface of the Book of Common Prayer. I don't think his bishop would have agreed with that, but nevertheless. And but he does go on to say that if you're reading anything extra, like the Latin parts, you need the sanction of the bishop. The evidence is that he did himself and didn't have the sanction of the bishop, but that's another matter. On to the next slide, and we see here an example. Here he is. This is Kenrick's. There he is illustrating with that wonderful tapestry, that wonderful painting by Burne-Jones of the Visitation of the Magi. He's got a version of that, pasted it in for the Epiphany, and there he is. On the other page, he's giving the prayers for the priest to be used in the preparation of the altar. Silently, he would have said, and silent prayers were all right in Latin, he would have argued. And interestingly, on the bottom of each page, as I've shown in the third slide, he is dating each page as he wrote it. That was done on the 5th of January 1905. It takes him about 2 years or more to complete the missal, and in some cases he's doing 1 page a day. So obviously he went home from his parish duties or whatever, and with the religious sister and his wife, there they were working on this wonderful manuscript edition of the English Missal. This is the first edition. Now, if we go on, here we find there was a tradition in English Missal. Kenrick, in the first three editions, the copyright was to him, and it was published mainly on large sheets, and you requested a copy and the printers bound it for you. That's why you often find in churches very different looking bindings of the English Missal. It wasn't until a touch later that it was more mass produced. And what was also possible is the churches could request certain propers or certain supplements to be slipped in. For example, for the feast of St. Charles, King and Martyr, those churches that wanted to observe that could be fitted in by the publishers. If we go into the next slide, we see as things progressed that the English Missal it varied according to what people essentially, the essential thing, Father Kenrick's great principle was that the English Rite of 1662 could be followed through the book in its entirety, no additions. The priest could use additional prayers. The priest's additional prayers could be the Roman canon in English, said sotto voce, or in Latin, said sotto voce, however way they wanted to fit that in. And other prayers could be fitted in too. But actually, the English Missal on the altar could also be used for the 1662 rite in its entirety. There were no interpolations, no additions to the 1662 rite, as there were to be in some others. Moving forward now to the next slide, we find just moving forward in years, I'll come back in a moment because we need to, but Father Drew, a friend of Father Kenrick's, after a while produced what many of you may have seen, the English Missal for the laity. And there's the good Father Drew at the priest's door of his church, and he produced this thick book, if you know it, the English Missal in a smaller form. The big problem of Father Drew's book was he wasn't always happy with Mrs. Kenrick's translations, and so he translated them differently at times. So the frustration was that the person in the pew following the service that the priest was saying at the altar could be reading something rather different, and yet both were the English Missal. But both Drew and Kenrick were very defensive of the English Missal and were reluctant to merge it with other missals. Going back now in the next slide, and moving a bit off-centre now, we've seen that the English Missal was either pure 1662 or pure Roman Missal. We've seen Sarum Missals, the influence of Salisbury, for example, in Diemer's English liturgy. We now have something that might be called Free Catholic. The People's Missal, the People's version, to which this slide on the left refers, first appeared in 1916. Now that's significant. That's in the middle of the First World War, where nationalism was running high in the country and the big sense of national British identity in the face of the war. This book, The Missal, was compiled by Ernest Alfred Leslie Clark, and he did so as a free Catholic. And he said he did so hoping that the church would arm itself with wide sympathies, religious and humane, in order to further the coming of the kingdom of God. It was a combination of optimistic liberalism and lofty patriotism, and it met with immediate response. It was republished in 1919 then again in 1922, and then again in 1929. But the altar missal, here we see, didn't come about till 1920. And look at that, from other ancient sources, national and universal for English-minded folk. Yes. Next slide, please. And here is the canon. And here Clarke is drawing on 1549, not using Roman Catholic sources of the day, but is keen to have this beautiful illustrations through his work and this very distinctive calligraphy being printed. Perhaps understandably, that kind of nationalism and pride faded, and actually this missal, the People's Missal, went out of print very quickly in the 1920s. But meanwhile, and I'm putting this in, another little missal appeared, which is really rare. I'm pleased to own a copy. Oliver, the next slide. And this is the Red Mass of the Comrades of the Catholic Crusade. I've spoken about this in previous talks to SCP and so on. This is the brainchild of the great Conrad Noel of Thaxted, leader of the Thaxted movement, who in, let me think, about 1920, I think slightly earlier, formed the Catholic Crusade, dividing off from mainstream Christian socialism to form an Anglo-Catholic movement strongly influenced by the Russian Revolution, and in particular taking the Trotsky line of the Internationale. And the comrades signed up and believed very strongly that the Mass would bring about the kingdom of God. If we see on the next slide, they they had their own prayers, their own version, and he is drawing very strongly on the 1549 prayer book, but with the idea that the Mass is the catalyst for the communist revolution in the world. And the comrades were to attend the Red Mass, ideally on a weekly basis. Noel celebrated this Mass every Saturday in Thaxted for the comrades, a very small, select body, but using their own version of the Mass, the Missal. I'm not sure, and again, I'd be interested to know if other political groups were using the Mass in this way. Conrad Noel's versions, for example, of the Divine Praises are really quite radical, even, I think, for today's ears. Meanwhile, moving back more to the center in our next slide, we see the Anglican Missal, published in 1921 by the Society of St. Peter and Paul. Now, here, the Society of St. Peter and Paul, who produced these wonderfully illustrated missals and tracts and other books, mischievously calling themselves printers to the Church of England, and the Anglican Missal here was in fact a putting together of a series of booklets that they did. They were very proud of the work and described it as the outcome of 10 years. And it was aimed to provide the whole Anglican body, not only members of the Church of England, with a book in which it can find and follow with devotion and with intelligence all that is to be said and done at the altar in offering the holy sacrifice of the Mass every single day of the year. So, a bold claim. This was published, and then a parallel version on thinner paper with typical SSBP humour was published, called The Church's Missionary Manual. Sorry, The Church's Missionary Missal. And because it was published in booklet form, on our next page, next slide, we'll see, if you look at the top right, it says C25, because this missal, frustratingly in a way, had no consecutive page numberings. A1 to 270 was Propers to Advent 1 and Passion Tide. B1 to 116 had Holy Week. C1 to 56 was the Ordinary and Canon of the Mass, and so on. The contents were much the same as the English Missal, but in general, the translation was better. It can safely be said that Mrs. Kenrick in the English Missal went for literate translations of the Latin. The Anglican Missal went for literary translations. And one of the main minds behind the translation was Ronald Knox, son of the then Bishop of Manchester, later, of course, to become Monsignor Ronald Knox. This work, the Anglican Missal, has many merits, and it was the first comprehensive altar book to offer, as a form of the canon, the 1662 prayer of consecration, followed immediately by the prayer of oblation. But it was too controversial for universal Catholic support, and the English Missal continued to be published right through into the 50s, in fact, 1950s, because the Anglican Missal, it felt, had put its own interpretation on 1662, and that wasn't acceptable. If we now move on, we see there how the Anglican Missal, there again, look at the top right, E57, the section here dealing with propers of the season, sorry, the Sancrale, and this is Candlemas. Again, these fine illustrations, both in people's and in altar versions. Now, what happened in the 1920s, of course, was the main Church of England was looking at prayer book revision, and the deposited book to the House of Commons was presented in 1928. And as most of us will know, the prayer book was rejected by Parliament in 28 and then in 29. This was a body blow in many ways to the Church. And what happened was that some Anglo-Catholic churches then produced very much 1662, showing they were loyal to Parliament and the authorised right, as it were, although the bishops let it be known they wouldn't frown on people using the 28 right. But in our next slide, we see St. Margaret's Church in Oxford. This missal, an interesting one, not many copies were produced, but it's compiled by Father Pullen, who was the parish priest there from 1906 to 1943, with his curate helping him. It's a missal very much of the 1662 prayer book, with music for the prefaces, votive masses, and so on, but he draws the authorization from those sanctioned by the bishops of Oxford since 1882. So he's drawing on various what he sees as authorised resources. And in fact, they most probably were authorised in the Diocese of Oxford, but the Diocese of Oxford only. And this missal really did only exist within Oxford. But meanwhile, in our next slide, Father Kenrick and the editors of the Anglican Missal got together and discussed whether it was possible to produce a joint altar missal. They couldn't agree. And Kenrick had the copyright of the title English Missal. Bishops took exception to that title, but Father Kenrick was resolute. They couldn't agree, and although the Church Times announced this, that the altar missal was in preparation, it never surfaced. So the two parallel missals, one with a bit more emphasis, just a little more on Sarum, the English Missal presenting 1662 in Rome in pure form, and Diema's English liturgy with many Sarum editions were the principal missals in use in the late 20s, early 30s. But then in 1932, I think, next slide, please, Oliver, this missal appeared. This is the altar missal of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, although interestingly, it wasn't always used by them. It was certainly published by them and for them, published by Mowbray's. The editor was Father Trenholm, quite a well-known Cowley father. He spent a lot of time in Iona when the Cowley Fathers ran the retreat house there and produced liturgy in use, the smaller offices in use in the church, the Episcopal Church of Scotland, the day hours of the church for use there, and later widely used. But he also produced this altar missal. This missal, as the contents of my version of it here show, carried other Eucharistic prayers. The South African rite, where the Cowley Fathers had a house. Later, they also had the American Episcopal Church's Eucharistic prayer incorporated in different editions of it. Now, if we go on to the next slide, this is again the Cowley Missal, as I'll call it. It was often called that, the Cowley Missal. What's happened here is that Trenholm has picked what you could almost say cherry-picked from the Sarum and Latin rites and created this missal of the best bits, whilst also retaining traditional Church of England. So there's the good old prayer of humble access, but running on the parallel side of the page, we've got the Latin canon going on, and so on. Because there were, of course, those churches, as some of you will know, where the English canon was said, and then silently the Latin canon was said. And indeed, even in my late 30s, I met a priest who was just retiring, who told me that when he finished his first curacy in London, and when he went to his second curacy, it was the first time he had said the canon of the Mass in English. Throughout his first curacy, he'd said it in Latin. Now, my copy of this missal has an interesting section which leads us on in the next slide. Because here you see what was beginning to happen. Priests were pasting into missals or writing in additional parts that they were using. Remember, I told you that Kenrick's early editions, you could get your own bits put in. Well, that stopped as they were more mass-produced, and people started to interleave themselves. Here, somebody has included Series 3, rather curiously, into this missal, quite extensively with the words, and the priest would clearly have been using this at the altar or carrying it around with him. So it would look a very dignified book, but he had this pasted in. And I've certainly seen in one or two of the missals at Pusey House these interpolations into the missals. Sometimes, and helpfully, my version here, he's used a very strong glue, frustratingly for me, in the missal that he was using. But this heralds what was beginning to happen from the 1950s and 60s. 1950s, the Roman Holy Week, the Easter Eve liturgy changed, was modernized. Then, of course, Vatican II and the new services of the Church of England, a selection of which we see in the next slide. I'm not going to dwell a lot on these. Some of you may be pleased at that. But it was a time of liturgical experiment. I've shown there in the Church of England, second series, series 2, series 3. Series 1 was what used to be called interim rite, an older traditional language. Series 2 became very popular in the Church of England in its day. It was a framework liturgy, really. The alternative service book drew all this together, and Scotland was doing similar things, although not as, dare I say, not as extravagantly, perhaps, as the Church of England, or comprehensively, maybe a kind of way of putting it. And of course, Rome was producing its own missal. Now, the Roman Missal of 1960 presented a dilemma for the users of the English Missal, because they were saying they could do no other than use some of them were saying they could do no other than use the Roman Rite in the English Missal, as it had the most authority. Well, that went in the 60s with the new Missa Normativa. So what were they to do? Well, some used it as a time to actually go on to Anglican orders. Others dived into the modern Roman Rite, which actually began to resemble very much the alternative service book. There was a convergence there of liturgies. And so it was not difficult, really, to continue using a modern Roman Rite, even though that may have gone against one's sensibilities over the English Missal. And so in 1980, in our next slide, we see what could be called a missal, although in Anglican style it's called altar services, not a missal, although the word altar was avoided in the Book of Common Prayer. And this rather fine edition with, I think, rather curiously, if not absurdly, rubrics in blue rather than in red. Goodness knows who thought that up. But a fine copy produced by the privileged pressers of an altar book, producing several versions of the Eucharistic canon and so on. And then, of course, in our next slide, we see the Common Worship book. This isn't really a missal because it contains all the services. It isn't altar services. It's just a large version of Common Worship. President's edition, it has some extra material in it for use at the altar, but it's not a missal of the format and form that we've been discussing. And in our next slide, we see the modern Roman Missal. This is edition 3, where Rome went away, for example, from the Lord be with you and also with you, to the Lord be with you and with thy spirit. That was a pity, in my opinion, but I'm not a Roman Catholic, so they can do what they wish. But it caused ecumenical divergence, and it caused Anglo-Catholics some problem. Were the more papalist ones to go along with Rome, undoubtedly, if they were that way inclined, or were they to try and blend as much as possible into common worship, which many did. And in fact, the church I worked in at the time, we did that too. I've come to the end of the missals, but I want to go on to the next slide because I want to draw out some points for you. And these are they for your personal reflections arising from what I've said. We've seen that the early missals were designed to help the priest to pray at the altar, in addition to the liturgy that was before the priest. Is that happening today? Is the missal today of quality? Is it worthy, an object of beauty on the altar? That was an aim, for example, of Father Kenrick in his missal. Has the liturgy in our missal developed, inspiring awe and wonder and richness? Where does the authority in the church come from, in liturgy and in other things? If we're saying it comes from Rome in liturgy, as some would, what about moral theology? Does that come from Rome's teaching too, on contraception, for example, or homosexuality? There is a dilemma that Anglo-Catholics feel there over authority. And ultimately, those who are still using the English Missal, of course, are doing so on the personal authority of a priest or congregation, because the book isn't approved in Anglicanism or in Romanism, Roman Catholicism. Have we got communicant manuals or guides, as the missals often did? And Dioma's communicant manual, A Sanctuary, well out of print, was a wonderful book to give to people being confirmed and to help. Think of Conrad Noel and Clark in their missals, in which they were being politicizing in some way the liturgy, but in a way that was allowed to a degree. Are we blending? Are we looking at the future kingdom of God as we celebrate the liturgy? And a final thought is always the danger of recovering medievalism. Now, reinventing, of course, isn't quite recovering. I deliberately said reinventing. We can draw, because I firmly believe that the wise person draws out of their bag treasures old and new, and we discard the old at our peril, but we reject the new also at our peril. Thank you very much.
Father Ian, thank you very much for that. I'm just adjusting some things on my screen, and thank you for bearing with me as I advanced your slides. I know that was something to contend with. I really appreciate that. I just wonder now. I loved seeing the range of materials that was there, and of course, you raised a lot of questions at the end about how Anglicans have understood and continue to understand Eucharistic prayer. So I think it's a good thing we have time now for that, for some questions. Can I ask, if you'd like to speak, to please click the raise hand button, and I'll bring people in one at a time. Now, I'll do my best to keep things moving in this room so that everyone has a chance, everyone with a question has a chance to ask it. I will look for the raise hand. If you could just, in my version of Zoom, it's moved, so it's under the share button. If at the bottom, if you're on a computer, and there is an option. Oh, sorry, not the share button. It's the react button. I misspoke. So under the react button, you'll find that raise hand function, and you can indicate to me that you would like to ask a question. Are there any questions? And I'll just hold a little bit of silence here. as people think of their questions. But perhaps, Father, I could ask the first one then. Um, you talked to us about old and new and needing to blend the two. In your own personal practice, tell me, Ian, where do you find yourself and how do you find yourself meeting those two things? Like, can you give me some examples, like some practical things of ways in which you would integrate old and new together in your own personal practice?
Yes, that's a very good question, Oliver, and thank you for it. Um, I'm retired from parish ministry now and lead worship in a huge variety of churches. So this question actually comes up quite a bit in my mind as I celebrate different liturgies in the Church of England. And I discover more and more that somebody following common worship in one church follows it very differently in another, so that the liturgies, even although the same by name, are very different. I find it very useful to have to hand one or two books that assist me in preparing for worship, and also in sometimes leading worship if it's appropriate. I've always found the Roman Missal, not the most modern, although I do have an edition of that, but the previous one, quite helpful in providing alternative prefaces, for example, which are legitimate, can be used in common worship, and in additional prayers and sentences if I want to use them. So that would be one thing. And there are I've found very handy. There's one called the St. Luke's Daily Missal, which is in effect a reduced version of the whole Roman Missal. So I find that helpful. I also find just my own knowledge of missals and knowing where to go for certain things helpful. Now, I know I can't exactly share that. I'm not telepathic to share that with you. But I do think it's useful to thumb through and look at some of these older missals and see what they were doing. And sometimes it's the inspiration, not necessarily of the text, but looking at how was a requiem mass, what texts were used, what thought was going on in some of the areas where common worship can be a little weak. But also the danger though is common worship has an enormous number of options. And if you look at the older missals, they didn't. And it's actually probably quite wise not to use too many options, I think.
Excellent. Thank you very much. There's a question from Gordon Burgess Park. I'm just going to ping you to the screen here and ask you to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Ken,
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, Gordon.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well. Good.
Good, good. Two things that are not exactly questions. One of my main issues with common worship is that there is far too much variety.
Yes, that's the
as
last point I've made.
yeah,
Yes.
as
Yes.
Father Ian said, if you go to a strange church, you really don't know what you're going to get,
Yeah.
which to me is not an advantage, especially if you're a stranger in a strange area.
Yeah.
The second thing is, it's an anecdote actually, that my wife and I were up in the Lake District some years ago, and we went to oh, what's the abbey on the coast?
Oh, I've
The,
forgotten
the
now.
ruined one.
Oh,
Just had a senior moment. Anyway, doesn't matter where it was.
yes.
Whitby.
No, the,
No.
the East Coast, the West Coast,
Oh, the West.
the other side. Anyway, we'd done our tour of the Abbey, and as we came out, we noticed that there was a service being set up out of doors, and it was Holy Communion or Mass. So we tagged on at the back of this, and we very quickly discovered that it was a Roman Catholic Mass. So when we didn't go up to receive, we went up for a blessing. After it had finished, we had lots and lots of the congregation coming up to us and saying, "Why didn't you receive communion?" And so we said, "Well, we're not Roman Catholic, we're Anglicans." And their comment was, "Oh, but you knew all the words."
Yes. That's
So
yeah.
I think,
If I Yes, if I can respond, Gordon, two very good points. I think I happen to know you're not a priest, and
Mhm.
I think there is a role for the laity to say what you said in the first point, that they find too much variety disturbing. And I think that's worth saying. And I think allied to that is my point, and I know it's been made recently broader in the Church Times and so on, that we are lacking help to prepare for communion. We're not telling laity how to do it. We haven't communicant manuals and so on. And that is particularly difficult if you don't know what they're coming to anyway on a Sunday. Um, and so I think my response to you is to speak up and say it, as I've said. I think it would be good if bishops let it be known that some Eucharistic prayers are to be preferred over others, for example.
Well, I don't think that there's any need for 8 of them.
No, well, I think there was a bit of liturgical archaeology going on when they were produced. I don't believe there are many churches that would ever go round in a row with all 8. Now, the second point, actually, I agreed with, and you pick that up when I said about the third edition of the Roman Missal. It's unfortunate, I think, that we've diverged a little because our texts were common. And I firmly believe the closer we can be together in liturgical texts among churches, the better for the Christian church. Thank
Absolutely.
you, Gordon.
Yeah.
Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Richard Pears, I know you're there. Oh, there, a light illumines your face. Can I ask you to
Oh, no.
unmute?
Oh, no, I can't cope with Richard's questions.
Oh, you're muted.
Mute.
Oh,
Can you hear
Richard,
me now?
be kind, Richard.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Can you
Yes.
hear me?
But yes, I can. And Father Ian, that was a magnificent talk. And you showed me some things that I haven't seen before. And I was thrilled to see them. I think it's a great tour that you've given us of Anglo-Catholic missals. I suppose my question is a little bit, I mean, I absolutely adore that liturgical history. And as you know, I love, um, all of that stuff. But I find myself I suppose there's a little bit of a question about validity, although it's not a concept I particularly believe in. I just
Mm.
wonder what you think about it. I think a priest, bread and wine, and the words of institution are probably enough for the mass.
Yeah.
And I mean, so I say Mass every day, and I use Eucharistic prayer H from Common Worship, which I know all Anglo-Catholics hate. Um, um, but it's simple, it's straightforward, it just does enough. And I don't, if I was a parish priest, which I'm not and haven't been for a very long time, and et cetera, I might want something richer. But I just kind of want your thoughts on that, really.
I Yes, I have every sympathy, Richard, and I think I maybe hinted at it that now in retirement I do so. I have always felt that a priest does not take the liturgy to a church, but you honour what is done in that church. And sometimes I slightly cringe at what I'm asked to do when I celebrate Mass in some churches. Um, but I agree entirely that I remember at college being asked to write an essay which was called "What is A, essential, and B, helpful in the Eucharistic prayer?" And actually, when you look at what is essential historically, it's very difficult to answer that because it's really very little. But desirable's another matter. I think the priest in a small, around the kitchen table, say, with students, is a very different experience to a high mass at St. Albans, Holborn, or whatever, and rightly and properly so. And I think Catholicism is about being open to that kind of breadth, really, and not being tied to a certain way of doing things. When I met the great Father Lamburn, he told me he prided himself that he had never celebrated Mass without wearing a maniple. Well, I wouldn't pride myself in saying anything like that, is what I'm saying. And I think Catholicism is bigger, dare I say it, than parts of Anglo-Catholicism. Well, it's bigger than Anglo-Catholicism, yes.
I think that's absolutely right. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much. I see Scott Calta has a question, but right before I get to you, Scott, I'm going to ask Father Philip, who's indicated to me in the chat that he has a question. Philip.
Father, thank you. I did read this.
Yes,
I did read this earlier.
Yes.
And thank you for your illustrated talk. Good.
Yes.
And that took me back to your illustration of the altar services. And I was reminded that as a curate, I served in churches where we had the altar services, but ACS had bound up the missal with the Roman rite.
Yes.
And we largely used that as a form of subterfuge, I guess. And my thoughts are, where would you place the ordinariate liturgy as a development or even a regression, possibly?
I don't want to, I'd rather not comment on the ordinariate itself. First of all, the ACS,
the liturgy.
I didn't have time to go farther into the ACS book. I actually think it was a very good book. The ACS altar missal, it was ring bound, wasn't it? A plastic ring bound.
Hardbound, I found.
Book. It's a substantial book. It was good and had, for its day, attractive graphics and allowed. I used it a lot. I think the ordinariate liturgy, I think they were looking at first to use the English missal. That didn't come about, as it happens, partly because also they were catering for beyond England, of course, in the States. And they tended more to use the Anglican Missal, but added bits on and from the interim rite, basically. In my mind, it's slightly regressive. I think it was, yes, I'll only say that.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much. Scott, I've highlighted you on the screen here, and now I see a face.
You do.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Father, for this wonderful presentation. I am pleased because I have purchased so many books from you over the years. I mean, going back to, oh my goodness, 25 years, I'm going to say, years ago when I was a new eBay user. So it's my personal library has been greatly enhanced by you in many ways.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to hear that, Scott.
As we can clearly hear, I'm in the minority here because, of course, as an American, I'm probably outnumbered here. So I'm listening with that perspective. I think I'm fairly well acquainted with the differences in the situations on both sides of the pond, and of course, we never had the strong strand of Anglo-papalism here in the United States.
Yes.
It was just a very small group, but yet, ironically, and by way of full disclosure, I'm going to say that I grew up as an Anglo-Catholic, but since college, so over 40 years, I've been a Roman Catholic, but always still followed all of these matters through the years. But I always tended towards the Anglo-Papalist influence, which was very rare, few and far between here. So then part of what I was going to ask was already answered, because you commented on the newer Roman English translations and the ecumenical fruits of that, so that you kind of covered it there. Would you care to offer any more commentary on that? Because like here, I think ecumenically speaking, it has really, definitely has created a pretty the gulf is even wider now because of the differences in translation between the Episcopal Church here now and the Roman edition in English, but also just the fact that we never had the Anglo-Papalist group except for a few locations, get off the ground here. So that also just totally makes our perceptions very, very different. Everything here was the Anglican Missal, or the American Missal, the Cowley Fathers edition. Yeah. And only really it's St. Clement's in Philadelphia and still now the English Missal have any great use, and just very rare Anglo-Papalist priests, one of whom was mine, ever involved. So just, would you care to comment on any of that? I know it's a little muddy.
No, I think I'm really grateful, Scott, that you've brought in the American perspective. I tried to hint a tiny bit, but you know far more than I do. I think, to comment on the modern Roman Rite, I think part of the trouble is they almost looked to the liturgical language, the traditional language of Anglicanism almost in their translation, but didn't quite hit it off in the way that the older Anglican versions have. So I do celebrate in a parish not far from me that uses the Roman Rite. I celebrate there very occasionally, and I find it a little clumsy, really. And so I think I subscribe to the tablet, the International Catholic Weekly. And if you look in the letters column, you find the kind of discussion that you and I are having now going on between Roman Catholics. That actually there are those who look back to the earlier translation and those who wish they didn't have the new one. So it's not us and them. It's a bigger issue. It's about language and liturgical language. And I'm all one for liturgical language stretching us and, inspiring us. But sometimes reverting to traditional language doesn't actually do that. And also, having worked in a multicultural, multilingual congregation, I am really suspicious of some of the modern liturgical language. Yes, so I think it does bring about divergence, and that's very unfortunate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paula. And thank you for the question, Scott. Next question comes from Mark Voss. Mark.
Father Ian, thank you for all that you've given. Absolutely wonderful. I suppose I was reflecting on this whole business of teaching, of pedagogy in the liturgy, and specifically in the Mass. And my own experience as a theological student, and the fact that there's very little, at least in the institution I've been in for the past 2 years, very little emphasis on the formation of the priest as celebrant.
Yes.
And all that means for one's own devotion and discipleship.
Can I respond to that, Mark?
Yeah.
I'm just aware of time anyway, if you don't mind.
No.
I think you raise a very good point, and I do think this is an area that Anglican theological educators must look into. And it's not about having experience of this church and that church. It's about individual ordinands growing in their own tradition And it's also about being taught liturgy by doing, and being taught liturgy that is far more than the text. It's about the performance, the spirituality, the life that it creates. And I think it's very dangerous to say to priests, you have to be a sort of jack of all trades, where really they should be master of one style, but able flexibly enough to change. And so much, I hope, Mark, that someone like you will find a good curacy where they can grow in one definite tradition that they are comfortable with and enter deeply into the spirituality of the liturgy of the Mass. I am not convinced that all training courses, certainly in the Church of England, that the training courses will give that, not at all. So I think your experience is, I have heard many, many times.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's I concur with the perspective. I wanted to I was thinking as well about Dennis Taylor's little book, In His Presence, that as a confirmand of the late 90s, I was given.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's a lovely little book.
It was great. It's very dated now.
Yes, yes. But when you get ordained, and if you have some free moments, why not write one yourself like it? Because that's a big gap in the spiritual life of the Anglican communicant, I say.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ian, for that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the question, and Father Ian for that. That brings this session to a close now. Thank you once again, Ian, for this presentation and for engaging with our questions. And thank you to all of you for joining and taking part. Now, if you'd like to know more about Adorate or the Society of Catholic Priests or the 40 hours plus devotion taking place right now, this very week, you'll find everything that you need on the SCP website. That's www.societyofcatholicpriests.com. For now, good night, and thank you very much.
And thank you, Oliver. Thank you.